That's the good stuff right here. Hard, soft literature. Yeah. I mean, sort of, kind of. I tell you what, I'll check it out. You know, I'm not normally one to destroy books, but I'm just kind of big for it. Hiya folks, Fruit and Doggy here to do another book discussion, and today I am discussing Godless Citizens in a Godly Republic, Atheists in American Public Life. This is written by R. Lawrence Moore and Isaac Kramnik. Page link is just around 200. Excuse me. And starting off as I always do, just going to read the book summary. If the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects religious liberty, why doesn't it protect atheists? God occupies our nation's consciousness, even defining to many what it means to be American. Non-believers have often had second-class legal status and have had to fight for their rights as citizens. As R. Lawrence Moore and Isaac Kramnik demonstrate in their sharp and convincing work, avowed atheists have been derided since the founding of the nation. Even Thomas Paine fell into disfavor and his role as a patriot forgotten. Popular Republican Robert Ingersoll could not be elected in the 19th century due to his atheism, and the suffragette Elizabeth Cady Stanton was shunned when she questioned biblical precepts about women's roles. Moore and Kramnik lay out this fascinating history in the legal cases that have questioned religious supremacy. It took until 1961 for the Supreme Court to ban religious tests for state officials, despite Article 6 of the Constitution. Still, every one of the 50 states continues to have God in its constitution. The authors discuss these cases and more current ones, such as Burwell v. Hobby Lobby Stores, Inc., which address whether personal religious beliefs supersede secular ones. In Godless Citizens in a Godly Republic, the authors also explore the dramatic rise of an atheist awakening and the role of recent organizations and their intent on holding the country to the secular principles it was founded upon. And it mentions that Lawrence Moore is Professor Emeritus of History, American Studies at Cornell University, and Isaac is Professor Emeritus of Government at Cornell University. So both professors at Cornell, and they are the authors of The Godless Constitution. Okay, I had forgotten that point because I found it interesting how the book kept referring to what they call the Godless Constitution, and it's because the Constitution of the United States doesn't include a reference at all to God, Creator, Deity, or any such thing. So that's why they were so hung up on that particular phrase, because they wrote a book with the same title. Makes perfect sense. So, part of the reason I got this book as a Christian was simply the title caught my interest. I was somewhat curious about the precept that the author set forth, this idea that atheists are somehow second-class citizens of the United States, have been since the very beginning. And I was very curious about that, especially as a parallel to other minority groups that have not done incredibly well through United States history. African Americans, American Indians, Native Americans, there's so many different terms and so forth, whatever. But less common ones that come up: German Americans, Methodists during World War I, Japanese Americans during World War II, and ones that are almost never mentioned nowadays would be like the Irish and Italians early on in the Northeast. But anyway, excuse me. What I was curious about, what I suppose made me so curious about it is, even though I've heard some reference or idea about those different minorities, those different groups of people having different issues and struggles throughout our history as a nation, I really have almost never heard of anything that atheists have had to deal with in this country, aside from more militant or radical atheists, such as those who sue about "In God We Trust" on our money, for instance. And basically, this book is broken into two main areas. The first half deals with historical issues in the United States, how atheists have dealt with different matters from the founding of the nation. I don't know if they put a specific year to this, but I'm going to say about the 1900s seem to be, early 1900s. And then from that point forward, the second half of the book is more recent matters. Excuse me. Issues and matters that pertain to atheists within the last few decades, about the last century. Pardon. And there's definitely quite a few different sections of this book that I wanted to point out in particular. But if I were to summarize my experience with the book, there's a few things that come to mind first of all. First is that I found the book to be a bit dry and boring, because despite the subject matter about, it's a fairly inflammatory claim, atheists being second-class citizens, it doesn't really live up to that idea incredibly strongly. And considering what the core thrust of the book is, I'm pretty sure that the authors have searched for all pertinent, all of the strongest issues, or the strongest events that would support their claim that they possibly could find, especially historically. But it doesn't. That's where I get into the second point, is that I don't think that they really support their own thesis or their own presupposition or argument that atheists are this second-class citizen group who have greatly suffered, who have been denied different rights. It just doesn't really add up to that. But one criticism that strikes me about the book, even if I agreed with it completely, would be how they handled their citations, their sources. This is the first thing you read almost. About citations and sources. To keep our book as accessible as possible, we have dispensed with footnotes. Many of the primary sources we have used have been published in multiple editions and can easily be accessed online. To cite a page number in a specific edition of Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia is superfluous and in fact not very helpful. It's far simpler for our readers to Google important quotations. Dates and page numbers from secondary sources and from some primary material, including newspaper articles, are contained in chapter notes at the end of the book. Also in those chapter notes are short lists of books we have not cited that may interest readers. There's a few issues I have with this. The first is that even if you were to conclude that there are so many different editions or sources from which you could obtain information on founding fathers, their quotes, their materials, their thoughts, speeches, writings, letters, etc., or even just any historical figure, that doesn't mean that you dispense with the entirety of having a footnote system. Because, well, that's the first part. And so they might have a point that it's not necessarily helpful to cite like a page number. Okay, I understand that. There's so many different editions, and if you're not utilizing the same primary source or the same copy, a page number may not be relevant. But to dispense with footnotes entirely really bothers me, because that is it's kind of a general consensus for any sort of book of this nature that's political, scholarly, academic, any sort of book that has an argument to put out and is going to source it out, is going to supply their perspective, you put some meat on the bone to shore up their walls, to make sure it's a solid foundation and a solid structure, and they simply dispense with it out of hand. And so, as you're reading through the book, they will quote specific people occasionally. They'll make mention to certain books or writings, but not for every single statement or claim that they would make. And a big problem with the way that they handle the chapter notes is, again, they specify to a certain extent, but only just so. So they talk about some different legal proceedings that happen, especially, that's more in the later chapters. But I would argue that if you're looking through historical records, that you really want to be incredibly clear and draw a strong delineation between points of view, writings, quotes, etc., from people of that time, and then your interpretation of that. And a very simple way to do that is with footnotes. Is with different citations throughout your writing that show, hey, you know what? This isn't me saying this, or this isn't me saying this alone. I am supporting this with this source, this citation. And that is simply a indicator for the reader that, hey, if I want to look into this further, I can look at this source and get kind of a compare and contrast. I can get an idea in my head, you know, maybe where they were going with this, how they support this, how they think it connects. But in this case, it's much harder. The water is muddier because it's not always 100% clear those things that they're simply taking for granted, that they're assuming is kind of a general knowledge, perhaps drawing from a perspective of consensus. Hey, if you're already on the same point of view we are, or if you're kind of in the same circle of theory, you have the same interpretation of events and history that we do, this will be readily accessible to you. You'll pick up on it quickly. And I suppose I'm beating this dead horse a little bit, but it just really annoyed me, and I just think it set a kind of a bad tone for the book. I don't see how their paltry little excuse justifies dispensing with footnotes completely. I don't see any good reason to do that. Especially not with even the reason they're providing. And what I find funny is, again, even if they had done that through the rest of the book, in the prologue, they make a claim. Is it first page? It is, first page. They say that many of the founding fathers were deists. Now, I've heard that theory, that general idea tossed about in general, but that isn't a claim you could support, and especially what all the implications, if they really were deists, how far that went, what their personal beliefs were, etc., without quite a bit of citation. You'd have to source that out to multiple points of view or multiple sources, because you're dealing with the personal beliefs of multiple men. You know, there were many founding fathers, there were many thinkers in that time. who founded our country. So I don't know. It just sort of annoys me that they toss that in with the prologue, where, hey, we're not going to cite this, even if you check the back of the book. We don't cite that. There's no prologue chapter notes. So kind of like the opening arguments that an attorney might make, it's kind of treated as a free pass. They don't have to cite whatever they claim. And another one I find funny is they argue that many non-believers, many people who would truthfully rock bottom would be atheists, don't utilize that term because of the stigma, and so they use other terms such as humanist freethinkers or agnostics, which I think is somewhat telling, to be entirely honest, that they would consider atheists and agnostics be the same people or to hold the same belief, because there is a clear delineation between the two. An atheist believes there is no God. An agnostic simply says, I don't really know. I'm not strongly committed one way or the other. Maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't, but I don't think it's possible for human beings to figure it out. Those are really clearly separate beliefs. And it always annoys me when people blend the two together. But anyways, that's just the very beginning. That's sort of introductory materials. But as you go through the first part of the book, they do, I think, a reasonable job of presenting how in early United States history, atheists may have had some of their rights, I'll go so far as to say maybe trampled on. I think that's a little bit too strong, but their rights maybe weren't as strong as Christians. The examples that they gave were their testimony wouldn't be accepted in a court of law. And that would include, defending yourself, presenting your own defense, speaking out like, hey, this did or didn't happen. Because of the general distrust for atheists, their word was seen as completely worthless. And frankly, I thought that was probably one of the best examples of how it's like, you know what, that really would be a pretty significant loss. Not being able to defend yourself in a court of law. But contrasting that, really all they have, it's not anecdotal evidence, but it's only a few handful of situations where certain public figures were, perhaps not given as much respect or likability, or some of their ideas were discredited because of their personal beliefs, because of their atheism. But a lot of that is, to an extent, hypothetical, because there's no way to get a general summary of all people's beliefs at that time, how they responded to these figures. We can only assume how the general public responded. But, another aspect to that is, even in this book, which is very sympathetic to these individuals, it demonstrates how the individual's own acerbic nature would work against them. So they would be so abrasive, insulting, and dismissive to believers, to Christians, that it sounds similar to how some atheists speak about Christians today, that they're delusional, irrational, they don't have a belief in science and reason and logic. And so, what could you really expect? That people who put out that point of view and perspective, who insult, again, a vast majority of all people in the United States, and they're not well received and they're not well liked. Doi! What do you expect? An example or two, that they try to make stick, and I don't think they did a great job, was some guilt by association that happened with a few atheists, some who were sort of revolutionaries. If I'm not mistaken, the ones that I'm thinking of, they were calling for switching from a capitalist society to communism, and they got sort of mixed in with some individuals who were... It was basically conflating non-violent atheist communists with violent ones. But even if it would be a fallacy for people at the time to have a guilt by association mindset, it wasn't strictly irrational. You had people who were in the exact same group, and again, even by the author's admission, throughout early United States history, there weren't very many atheists, at least outspokenly. I believe that probably throughout United States history, there were always been a small subset of atheists. Maybe some never, told anybody about it. They just never went to church. Maybe some of them would do what everybody else does. You just discuss these things with family, with friends, with neighbors, work colleagues. You just have reasonable, respectful discussions. And because you're not a public figure, nobody ever knew. It never went anywhere. It never went beyond those small spheres of influence. But when you have a small group of people who all belong to the same group, have the same general beliefs, ideas, goals in mind, and some of them have incited violence and a few of them didn't, I mean, yes, that's how to put it. It's completely wrong to judge one person for the actions of another, even if you belong to the same group. But again, just from my reading of the book and how it described those events, I could see how people would conflate the two. And again, timing's everything. This was all happening at, in a small period of time. There was overlap. So for people to think, oh man, this one group of communist atheists are violent. They've, I forget, something about an explosion, I want to say. I might be completely wrong. I'm not wanting to overstate what happened. It wasn't like hundreds dead or even dozens. I think it was a very small number of people who were harmed. But I could see how another small group of atheists who would be saying and doing the same things, give or take, could be painted with the same brush. So again, the first half of the book, I would definitely concede, a point or two how atheists at that time definitely weren't receiving their full, maybe not full, receive their full rights. Another one was the number of atheists who might have gone to jail for blasphemy. And again, that's a matter of scale. That's a matter of, I guess that's the best way to put it, scale. Because if that's only a few dozen atheists throughout all of American history, and only the ones who are the most, not just brazen and outspoken, but inflammatory and insulting, who went out of their way to basically stir up the pot and critique and mock all religious people, it's not that they deserve to go to jail, but again, that was the law at the time. And I'm not saying that's how the law should be. I'm not wanting to enact blasphemy laws. That would be a huge pain in the neck trying to sort out, and one person's blasphemy is another person's dogma. So let's not even gonna open that can of worms. But that's about the best or most prominent examples that were presented in the first half of the book. The ones I felt really kind of stuck and I would be willing to concede, the ones that I don't think really added up, that I didn't think held weight were a few guilt by association and what was the other one? I just talked about it a little bit while ago. But anyways, I mentioned it earlier. But what's especially funny to me is that, for this claim of their second-class citizenship and how, especially at the very beginning of American history, atheists just had it so bad. No mention at all of any atheists being run out of town, of being tarred and feathered, of being horribly beaten, stoned as like a heretic or a non-believer. Apparently that never happened. Or at least no recorded events. And the authors don't even suggest such a thing ever took place, that was a possibility in any sense. So, again, as far as I can tell, atheists didn't really have it too bad in early America. If those are the worst examples you could give, I'm pretty sure any other minority group who had it rough in those times would have traded places with an atheist. It's like, wait, that's all you have to deal with? Trade you. No problem. But some of the, aside from my complaints about the book's structure and some of the content of the first half, I think it was the second half I found to be sort of worse. And I think maybe it's because, again, my interest in the book stemmed from my lack of knowledge on these issues. And so, in the first half, I could at least take from it kind of a history in American culture. A chance to look back through the years from a different perspective. And it's like, okay, so that's how they interpret early America. It's nice to learn more about our nation's history. Even if it's not, again, the rosy, our founding fathers were amazing, looking at more sort of the problems and issues of the era. Again, I just find that interesting. But I think it's the more recent events that, again, because I don't think they really argue that strongly their point, that it just seems all the more weak. It just seems even more exaggerated, their complaints and their issues, what they're calling to be signs of the atheists being set, or I'll even use the word non-believers or nuns as another way of putting it. I probably will revert back to atheists, but just know I'm not opposed to using different terminology, unless it's agnostic, because it's different. But anyways, I just find the second half to be worse because it doesn't hold water. At least I don't think so. And I think a lot of their own arguments they sort of undermine unintentionally. So, for instance, sort of in the 120 and 121 area, they talk about how the Constitution of the United States is a godless constitution. And then, by contrast, every single state in the country, all 50 of them, mention in their state constitutions God. They explicitly do so. And just quoting directly from the book, this is from the New Jersey State Constitution. We, the people of the state of New Jersey, grateful to Almighty God for the civil and religious liberty which he hath so long permitted us to enjoy, and looking to him for a blessing upon our endeavors to secure and transmit to succeeding generations, to ordain and establish his constitution. And they give a variety of examples for different states. And so, what's funny is that this book mentions a few times this idea that the United States was, or has been, however you want to phrase it, a Christian nation. That's a really prominent aspect of our country. Let me see here. I thought there was... Other Americans, probably a majority in this deeply religious country, And then going on, I am skipping around with my quotes. And maybe I'm mixing up, but that's just kind of a example showing my point that they acknowledge to some extent that this country is deeply religious, strongly Christian. And yet, as I read the summary of the book, they argue that the country always was intended to be a secular run nation. But if you look at the founding fathers, if you look at how they led government in the early development of our country, it's clear that that wasn't their intention. They fully expected citizens to read the Bible, to derive their morality from Christianity, and that to be good public servants, civil servants, and to serve your country, that was instrumental, it was foundational and central. And when you look at early voting requirements, many of them required some, not exactly a religious test, but I think the term WASP came from that, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You had to be, I forget, you had to be a man, I think a landowner, and if I'm not mistaken, you had to not necessarily go to church to be a church member, but you had to be, I think it was Protestant. I might be slightly mistaken, but if they really were so hung up on the idea of being a secular country, it's very strange that, in our republic, that the incredible power of voting would be mandatory upon the idea of you being rooted in a religious belief. Doesn't really add 2 and 2 together to get 4 there, right? Oh, excuse me. Thought there might have been another part on this page specifically, but I think that was the general point there. That, well, I think the other part was this idea that the federal government, with the Godless Constitution, that was such a cornerstone to our country being secular. But then they also admit that, maybe it's the next area. Nope, not that I can see quickly and easily. But the idea is that the federal government, our Constitution not having reference to God, is indication of our country being secular. But at the same time, oh, I lost my train of thought. It's very simple. Oh, at the same time, also saying that the original intention for the federal government was that they were to serve a very restricted and small role. So the original inception of the federal government was that they were never going to be this massive, bloated force in any. It would serve a function. It would unify the entire country, but it was to be a lot of small state-run governments. That was basically the idea. And again, looking back through history, it's hard to fully understand and interpret their intentions, but from my understanding of history, that was sort of the idea. Some nebulous blend of state-run government and then a federal force holding over it all. But how large that force would be, definitely not how it looks now, but I think fairly limited. Another area I found really funny. I'm going on page 162, 163. 2 areas that caught my eye here was, 1, they complain, where the exact phrasing, and I quote, but nowhere is the private discrimination against atheists more blatant, emphasizing here, more blatant than in the Boy Scouts of America, where the Scout Oath includes the promise to do my duty to God and my country and to obey the Scout law. And as of this book being written, Boy Scouts is closed to non-believers, insisting that no boy can grow in the best kind of citizenship without recognizing his obligation to God. Now, they do acknowledge, of course, that the Boy Scouts of America, it's a private organization, but that is your most blatant example. That is your most horrendous example of a private organization not allowing atheists to participate or engage with. The Boy Scouts. And again, the Boy Scouts are a very old organization. I mean, it's not, the Young Pastors Association. It's not that overtly Christian, but I just find that hilarious. Like, that's your biggest grievance? A private organization against atheists is the Boy Scouts. Okay. And they even talked about how they just founded their own non-believer version, and it's like, yeah, that's your right to do so. If you want to have an atheist version of the Boy Scouts, nobody's stopping you. You can do the exact same thing they do. The badges, the camping. I just found that hilarious. It's like, real. Okay, I'm being dead horse again. But here, it's on the same page. Another quote. A Pennsylvania court in 1987, a South Carolina court in 1998, and a Mississippi court in 2005 all made child custody decisions specifically to the detriment of the non-believing parent. Okay? Now I'm just going to repeat the years again. 1987, 1998, and 2005. A period of time, almost 20 years, 18 years, and they list 3 examples of child custody decisions that were to the detriment of the non-believing parent. And the phrasing doesn't even say that it was made on the basis of that non-believing parent's non-belief. I'm sure that would be the conclusion they'd want you to draw. But 3 examples across 18 years. That's all you can find? Again, do you know how many men are found against, I can't even say it right, but don't receive a custody decision in their favor simply on the basis of them being the father instead of the mother? That the mother is so imperative that it's seen as she has to have at least partial custody? And I'm just sort of stupefied. I mean, why even bother saying that? 3 examples! That's it! And they claimed shortly afterwards, numerous examples of discrimination against non-believers have been exposed in the military. One soldier claimed, as reported in the New York Times of April 26, 2008, that he was discharged for his atheism. And despite this happening a few years ago, was there ever any validation or support showing that was actually the case? I mean, a soldier claims that, but was he discharged for a completely valid reason and he just happened to be an atheist? And he saw an opportunity to pull a Hail Mary and it's like, maybe I can make this public and I'll get a public endorsement and support and maybe a job or an outpouring of support. And maybe some media attention and they'll back off or they'll reinstate me. I don't know. I mean, that might have actually happened. But what I'm getting at is that even if you grant that the authors are completely correct with their examples that they provide, that there's no complicating factor, there's just no extenuating circumstances, their grievances are not incredibly strong. They're just weak. Another complaint that they make is how students of non-believers in schools have to say the Pledge of Allegiance. They either have to say it or they sit down and don't say it. And what I found so funny and so ridiculous is that even though they went to court for this multiple times and they saw, this was just such a huge issue and so important, there was an atheist group that said the Pledge of Allegiance, and it specified that all they did was omit the phrase "under God" as they said the pledge. So my completely logical conclusion there was, why couldn't the students simply make that same choice? The atheists, the adult atheists in their little group, when they were doing the Pledge of Allegiance, they stuck to the pledge as it is, just didn't say "under God," and that was it. What's so hard to do about that with students? That they simply don't say "under God" if they so choose, if they don't believe that. And another thing that invalidates their point of view or argument is, along with that notion, they presented this idea that, this gets into kind of a long drawn out point. I'm boiling it down to the very minute point, but they present this idea that children in school who are reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, because it included the phrase "under God," took it to have a greater emphasis on religion. And the reason I say that their point doesn't add up is because they also say that when it comes to non-believers in the United States, their greatest concentration is amongst millennials, as against the younger generation. So if their point is that saying the Pledge of Allegiance as is with "under God" in it is having an influence on children, then it's not having a very strong one, because all these young people, all these millennials, are non-believers regardless. So you're going to court for this issue multiple times, and it's not actually having any impact. Surprise, surprise. But I think one of the funniest things I find about this book is that they complain about how so many people in the country are who are distrustful of atheists, and how that's really not a commentary on the behavior or perspective or viewpoint of atheists, but again, it's just that's the stigma of atheists and non-believers. They're just unfairly mischaracterized. But there's, I think, so much in the second half of the book, even the first half, of different examples of attitudes and thoughts and perspectives the atheists have exhibited, again, publicly, that really gives credence to why people wouldn't trust atheists, or why they would be at odds with them. For instance, I think one thing that the book emphasizes as a positive is the idea that atheists are clogging up our court systems with all these lawsuits, trying to basically twist the arm of the government to act certain ways and to make laws to get their way. So even though they're a minority in this country, they're trying to force their will against everybody else, against the religious majority, to act a way that they think's appropriate. And I mean, you don't think people would have a problem with that? They might not raise their eyebrows and think, okay, so you're trying to tell the rest of us how to live our lives and how to act because you don't like hearing about God all the time. Okay. But it also gives different examples of advertisements about basically like public relations campaigns that atheists have undergone, and some of the phrases and slogans that they were using I just thought were so crazy. It's like, what else would you expect? Why would you think people would respond positively to these statements? You know it's a myth. This season, celebrate reason. Imagine no religion. Keep the merry, dump the myth. Who needs Christ in Christmas? Nobody. Yes, Virginia, there is no God. In the beginning, man created God. Dear Santa, all I want for Christmas is to skip church. I'm too old for fairy tales. I mean, you're gonna put those sorts of statements out publicly, trying to garner favor or garner the public's, general favor and likability. Raise your likability statistics, your trustworthiness with statements like that. I don't know. It just really surprises me that atheists or the authors don't seem to recognize that actions... How to put it? Not that actions have consequences, but people... Well, actually, it is somewhat of an actions have consequences. When you basically sue the ever-living heck out of people, when you insult and denigrate people, that they're not going to trust you. I mean, I don't know. It just kind of amazes me how tone deaf they seem to be on that. And what's also funny is, at the very end of the book, they suggest that maybe atheists need to start doing a little bit more in the form of like charity work if they want to showcase their capacity for goodness in a way that's comparable to religious folks. And it's like, yeah, it's a little bit closer to the right idea. Because if all you have to offer people in exchange for, their religious beliefs, hey, you want me to give up all of my religious beliefs in exchange for atheism, what do I get in exchange? Well, we're not incredibly well organized. Maybe we have some online presence, but we don't really have groups and buildings and organizations that you can go to. We don't have support groups. We don't have charities. We don't strongly support one another in the same way that religious folks tend to. We're dismissive and insulting of other people, speaking in broad terms, and nothing. We tear others down for their beliefs, not really having the foresight to think about how others could then do the same to us. But we don't really have anything that builds up our beliefs, that lifts ourselves up other than, puff out our chest and say, well, we're rational, we're reasonable. Like, okay, that's my frosting on the cake is I'm rational and reasonable. Okay. I just don't think they are thinking this out fully, but anyways, this has been a really long video. The book's not even that long, but I just think it failed in so many different areas that it's presupposition, its central core argument and idea, although theoretically interesting, was actually somewhat boring to read through in some ways. Didn't seem to be incredibly well supported. Maybe a few areas where I would acknowledge some shared ground and understand, like, hey, you know what, that is an issue. I could see why atheists would have objected to that, but when you put it against the context of what other groups have gone through in United States history, for atheists to keep trying to proclaim victimhood status, it just seems super ridiculous. And I think that's kind of the main gist. It's just such a joke that you're trying to proclaim yourselves to be victims and boo hoo hoo, woe is me, and you just don't have any good examples. I mean, you don't even have a single being run out of town. You're really gonna have to up your game if you're gonna be victims, guys. That's all I gotta say. But anyways, that's been my overly long talk on this book. I've got another book or two that's on more academic subjects, so they might be a bit long-winded too. I apologize in advance. I understand if you want to skip right over these, because I wouldn't want to watch a video this long. That's why I tend to break them up so much. But anyways, I'll see you around later. I mean, I couldn't help myself. What can I say? Anyways, I'll see you around later, folks. And as always, fruit and doggy! Yes, there really is nothing quite like curling up with a fine piece of literature, if you know what I mean.